And welcome to the Henry George School of Social Science. I thank you all for coming out for what I'm sure will be a very interesting seminar on a subject that I'm sure is on the minds of everybody who's got to work for a living and everybody who thinks about people who have to work for a living, and that is whether or not the robots and the automation and the artificial intelligence, et cetera, is or are eventually going to take all of our jobs. And my name is Alan Tonelson. I'm a trustee of the Henry George School. I'll be our moderator today. I also run a public policy blog called Reality Check. I hope you'll want to check it out. And we're very pleased to have as our guest someone who's especially qualified to speak on this question of what kinds of impacts the new technologies will actually have on the U.S. and the global jobs market. And he's also going to explain why this time, at least as he sees it, it's really different. His name is Robin Gaster. He's a very prominent economics and technology consultant based in Washington, D.C. His company is called Incumetrics. His clients have included major government agencies both in the United States and Western Europe. He's also a visiting fellow at the George Washington University down in Washington, D.C., and he holds a PhD in political science from the University of California, Berkeley. I should also mention he was formerly a senior technology analyst with Congress's former Office of Technology Assessment. And once again, Robin's going to tell us why this time it's really different and the robots are going to come to take all of our jobs. He'll speak for about a half an hour. We'll then open the floor to questions from the audience. I also want to thank our audience, our remote audience watching from presumably all corners of the globe. I don't believe we have the ability to take questions from you, hopefully at some point soon. And without further ado, Robin, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming out. So let me give you a little backstory to start with about why I embarked on a difficult quest to understand this subject. As Alan said, I wander around Washington a fair amount, and I find myself in meetings, especially with what I would call technology enthusiasts, innovation enthusiasts. And eventually I attended one too many meetings, and I heard yet again about how we're all going to learn to code and how the great new world that Silicon Valley is providing us is going to solve all our problems. And frankly, it pissed me off. I had been visiting Cleveland recently, and I saw just how tough it was in the Rust Belt and in other parts of this country, which are not part of the fast forward that we see on TV or on the internet. So I thought I should try and understand this and write about it, and I've been working on it for a couple of years. This particular talk is about why this transition that I see in front of us, which we're just starting to encounter, is going to be so different from the previous transitions. Mainstream economists tend to believe that this time is just like last time, that this is just like the transition from agriculture to manufacturing, from manufacturing to services, that it's going to be painful for some, it will take some time, but we will adjust. And in the end, the jobs we have and the life we have will be better than the one that came before. I hope to show you that there are challenges to that view. So why is this time different? It's just another transition, another set of changes in our economy and our labor market. The first place it's different is in speed. It used to be that it took decades for a major technology to be widely adopted in the US. That's no longer true. I don't know if you can read the chart from there, but it took 75 years for cars to reach 50% of the population. It took about 30 years for the telephone to do so. But it only took 6 years for the smartphone to do so. Internet is 10. It's accelerating faster. It's not as though we've reached the maximum yet. So how many of you have flown recently? Yeah, okay. So when you get to the airport, you don't check in anymore with a person. You check in by doing some kind of automated ticket stub type thing. You put your credit card in, whatever. Yeah. It took exactly 3 years for that technology to be implemented across the entire United States at every major airport. 3 years. That's all it took. All those ticket agents went off to do other things. So that's one example of speed. There are other examples that I think, when you think about them, become clear. Then these aren't all the most sort of obvious ones. Think about Encyclopedia Britannica. It was a dominant force for 250 years until Microsoft released Encarta on CD in 1999. And as it says up there, in 3 years, they lost half their market share. Bang. Of course, Encarta then lost all of its market share to Wikipedia very shortly thereafter. So the pace is extraordinary. Think about books. Borders was the beast that ate the book market, right? 2006, they were still making money. 2011, they were bust, gone. We can talk about CDs, we can talk about cameras. Cameras, it took 5 years for 80% of the camera market to evaporate. So the purpose of this is not to sort of, talk about woe is me. It's to say change is really rapid now. And it's rapid for a reason. Sorry, I'm having a little trouble controlling this very excitable mark. Don't worry about the details here. This is the underlying basis for rapid change in information technology in the digital world. This is about Moore's law. Moore's law states that the number of transistors on a chip is going to double approximately every 18 months to 2 years. Moore's law is important because that means the capacity of the computer is doubling every couple of years, right? Moore's law was formulated in 1965, 50-odd years back, and it has faithfully doubled every couple of years since then. You probably know the parable of the king and the chess master who asked for 1 grain of rice to double every time you move around the 64 squares of a chessboard. By the time you get to the 64th square, there isn't enough rice in the world to fill that bucket. So every time exponential change is powerful and unsettling. Think about it this way. Here we are now. In 2 years' time, we will have added capacity, the capability of capacity, equivalent to all the past computing advances in world history, just in the next 2 years. So the speed of the underlying technology has grown and continues to grow. And it's now transformed again. It used to be that when you did things, you did them on a computer. I remember when computers were new, and you did things on a computer and it was exciting. But what you could do was limited to your computer. Now, you hold a computer in your pocket. That cell phone in your pocket contains 58 times the memory of a Cray supercomputer from 1989. It's 64 times as powerful. It's an extraordinary shift. And the reason that that's possible is because instead of being limited by your individual computer, many of the computer processes are now done online in the cloud. And what matters there is if you need more power, you just add more computers in parallel. So the limits that Moore's law used to impose are long gone. So I thought it would be interesting and useful to check in with people who watch technology for a living and look for disruption. I want to point out that this is the percentage of senior executives who think that their industry, which they know well, is going to be disrupted in the next year. We are talking not decades, not years, but months. I think it's quite staggering that these people think that they're going to face a transformation within 12 months. One wonders what they are planning to do about it. I thought it would be fun to also point a little further ahead. These are some of the changes that tech experts are looking at and expecting. I particularly want to point to two of them. I think it's entirely likely that we'll see robotic pharmacists very soon. They're less likely to make mistakes, they don't cost much, and they follow very strict rules. This is ideal for automation. And they cost a lot of money. Pharmacists are expensive. So this is the first sort of little inkling of that. I particularly like, though, the idea of an AI machine on the board of directors. I find that fascinating. I do wonder what perks they'll be offering. So we've seen speed, and we've seen only parts of it, but speed obviously is accelerating. I want to point to something else, though. It's not just speed, it's scale. The US used to be a continental economy. We had relatively small amounts of trade, relatively small amounts of investment. This meant that what we did inside the country was decided within the country. It was decided by the great industrial firms who were based here and whose I guess, roots were really here. I mean, you go to the Ford plant up in Red River in Detroit, and you can see this enormous imprint that this company had on that area. Well, it ain't so true anymore. This is what's happened since about 1984, 85. The share of the US economy that is related to imports or exports has tripled, and it's now a third. So we used to be able to insulate ourselves from the rest of the world. Now, labor markets in China and India and intellectual property rules elsewhere and what the European Union wants to do about Google all matter. And we are not independent, and trying to build rules-based systems like WTO has been of only limited success, I would say. There's been a second thing going on too. We think about trade, we don't think quite so much about foreign direct investment. Our investment abroad, the resources that our corporations take to invest abroad has again tripled, this time from 2000. It's only 15 years ago that we were investing under $3 trillion annually, that our total investments were $3 trillion annually. Now, they're almost 8, probably are 8 by now. So what's happened is that those great US firms who used to be so firmly embedded in the US economy have, like all other multinationals, or many other multinationals, become unmoored. They go where the profit is. And indeed, I think they would argue that that's absolutely the right thing to do, and that they are not connected to America in the way that they used to be. We'll come back to that. I thought this would be a useful slide because we're now connected to a global economy that is itself globalizing rapidly. This shows the share of China and India in the global labor pool. And you can see that each of them contributes about the same number of warm bodies as all of the advanced countries in the world, including ourselves. It's not really possible to change your labor market so rapidly without it having significant consequences. And you can also see on the left side of the chart the rapid expansion in exports, especially for China, but also for India. That these are parts of the global economy that we need to pay attention to, and that change the balance of power inside our country and our economy. So let's talk about scope. Many discussions of automation and the future of work focus on low-end jobs. Look, if you're doing a job that is easily replicated, that doesn't take much thinking, and where it's pretty, what you do, it doesn't vary much, you are asking for automation. It's simple. If it's easy to do, you're going to automate. But it's not just that. Let's turn back to our doctors. All right, doctors do stuff that is not at all easy to automate and that is very, very highly trained, skillful. So what do doctors do? They diagnose, they treat, they hold your hand. If they're good, they hold your hand. All right? So the diagnosis part of that is part of the job of being a doctor. But I cannot imagine that in 10 years, diagnosis will be a job for a doctor. I can't see it. Doctors cannot keep up with the literature. They rely on their hunches and their experience, which is sort of radically biased by their personal, what's happened to them personally. They're strongly influenced by the marketing of Big Pharma. And with the best will in the world, they make mistakes. I think it's entirely likely that we will end up with a rule-based diagnosis system based on billions and billions of data points that will, on average, be much better. I think it's quite likely. In fact, I think it's absolutely almost certain. Why is it certain? Why will that particular function go away from doctors? Because it's expensive. Doctors are expensive. So it's not enough to be doing a repetitive job at the bottom of the labor market. If you're doing a really expensive job, there's a big incentive to find ways to unbundle what you're doing and automate what you can. We've already seen this with lawyers, by the way. Are any of you lawyers? I didn't think so. Lawyers used to make a ton of money out of what used to be called, what is called discovery. Right? So when you have a big lawsuit, you would have basically football fields full of relatively cheap workers, associates, grinding through the paperwork, looking through papers of all, on both sides of a big lawsuit. And the lawyers made a lot of money out of this. It's all gone. It's all software now. Right? Software looks through those electronic documents cheaply, inexhaustibly, and accurately. They're more accurate than cheap lawyers. That was an oxymoron. Cheap legal assistants. So what we've seen is not that lawyers have gone away, but that one leg of their business has dissolved underneath them. And it's caused some bankruptcies. And it's caused a lot of anguish inside the legal community because one big stream has gone away. Same thing is going to happen to doctors. Quite sure. I can talk about that at tedious length. But this is a slightly difficult chart to understand. It reflects the share of jobs in each of those industry sectors that are very susceptible to automation and those that...
If you just hold on, I'm going to move the microphone closer to you, okay?
Okay,
I'm
yeah.
deconstructed.
Okay, good. Is that better?
Yeah, let's hope.
Okay. Better? All right. So you can see that across the entire range of jobs, there are good chunks that are ripe for automation. And I would make 2 points about this. One, automation isn't the only thing. What Amazon is doing has almost nothing to do with automation. So there's change that is not automation, that is also important. But nonetheless, even within the automation world, there are many jobs and many tasks within individual jobs that are going to be automated in the next 10 years. I think we can argue indefinitely about different methodologies for evaluating which jobs and which tasks. I think you have to get down to the level of individual jobs and look at those. But anyway, so that's one thing. The second thing I would point out about this chart is that it's based entirely on existing technologies. This has nothing to do with AI and nothing to do with robotics, really. It's just what we can do today. I'll talk about AI in a moment, but also, I guess this is a good time to do it. Let me talk about creative jobs. People love to tell me that creative jobs will be protected. So I'm going to tell you a little story about AlphaGo. Are any of you aware of AlphaGo? Yeah, okay. So AlphaGo was a program developed by Google to compete in the game of Go. Go is a subtle game. It's much more complex and difficult than chess, and hence it's more difficult to automate. So in October 2015, Google unveiled their machine called AlphaGo, and it defeated the European Go champion. This was impressive. In March of the next year, AlphaGo competed against the world champion, defeated the world champion. Defeated the world champion 4-1. This was a champion who'd been around for many years. In the course of beating the world champion, AlphaGo made a number of extremely unusual creative moves that have upset established strategy and thought in Go that's been in place for hundreds of years. It took them 3 months. So, one final point on AlphaGo. The most recent iteration of AlphaGo is not actually trained at all. It trains itself by competing against itself. It's now better than the trained version. So to believe that there is something inherently human and about creativity is, I think, perhaps to be fooling ourselves. I think it's going to be hard to separate out the robot poetry, is what I think. I mean, admittedly, it's hard to read some human poetry, but nonetheless, we don't need to go there. Anyway, so let's talk about how we're going to deal with this. One of the things that we hear constantly is, well, it's a knowledge economy. You have to have knowledge. You have to have training. You have to have a degree. So this is where we are. As of 2012, of the most recent entrants into the US labor market, about 1/3 had a bachelor's degree. That share has been increasing about 5 percentage points each decade. So it's growing, but it's growing slowly. Another third, about 30%, have no more than high school. The rest have an associate's degree, or they tried college and they dropped out. The knowledge economy works for college-educated people. We absolutely have to figure out how we're going to make it work for people who don't have college. We have to. That's 2/3 of our population. Especially if we're going to automate easily automated jobs, which is what they used to do. So this is the college conundrum. All right? So the yellow line at the top is your weekly median earnings if you have a college degree. And you can see they're up a bit. Not great, but up a bit. But if you look at what happened to the rest, it's pretty disastrous. It makes poor reading. Everybody has lost ground, and you can see that according to the College Board, the lifetime premium for going to college is $1 million. That's how much more you're going to earn if you complete your bachelor's degree, on average. We'll talk about average in a minute. So I just thought I'd do a little calculation and figure out if you took the cost of a college, the average cost of college, and you took the average earnings that you've foregone by going to college, right? It takes you 5 years. Maybe you could earn $20,000, $25,000 if you worked full-time in some poor job without a college degree. So by going to college, you've foregone $125,000. And then it's cost you $100,000 to go to college, now to go to an in-state college. So if you compound that over 45 years at 5% a year, that's what you get. $2 million. So you've actually paid $1 million for the privilege of going to college, more than you get in terms of benefits, financial benefits from it. So you have this problem that it seems like in order to be earning a middle-class income, you increasingly need to go to college. But on the other hand, going to college costs you so much that you come out at the back end of that anyway. So let's look at something else that's going on here. This is a direct consequence, I think, of the digital revolution. So if you want a job today, what do? Used to be, you'd read the newspapers, pound the pavement, talk to your buddies, and try and get in to see someone. That's how you used to get a job. Today, you submit a resume online. Well, that's cool. It means there are lots more jobs for you to look at. But from the employer's perspective, it's kind of disastrous. So you post your ad for administrative assistant, okay? You post it and you get 2,000 responses. What do? You're not going to read 2,000 responses. Nobody can do that. So what you do is you say, okay, well, we'll set up a filter. And what's the simplest possible filter? Oh, okay, we'll look for ones that have a college degree. Right? So what this chart shows is the blue bars show the percent of current job holders who have a BA. Right? And you can see it's like 40, 20, 40, maybe 50 for business and ops. But that's what it is. The orange bars show how many current job postings require a BA. And you can see they're all half as much again. So people are having to have a BA to apply for jobs that don't really need it. And what that also means is that 2/3 of the population is scratched from the race before they even begin. They have no chance because they are not going to get through that filter. So, just to make things worse, I'm a bearer of good tidings all the way around here. If you do have a college degree, it's worth pointing out that about half of you are not going to be working in a college-level job. About half will, and you can see that gray line has increased somewhat. But those who, you can also see pretty much exactly the Uber crowd down there in the orange line. Those are the people who have poor-paying, temporary-type jobs. They have a college degree. I'm sure you've met plenty of Uber drivers who have a college degree. That's where they are. What's happened to the blue line is important because it used to be that you could get a pretty good, well-paying job that didn't really require a college degree, but nonetheless, if you were college ed, you'd take it. It's a decent job. But you can see that that started to decline. All right, let's move on to the next thing. I'm trying to move through this as rapidly as I can.
We're going okay.
Yeah, so this is really about, okay, so how are we positioned to adjust to this? We have big challenges in terms of change. We now face a global world that is much more complex, and we have an educational system that clearly seems to be relatively poorly matched to what we need. So how are we going to adjust to this? And I would say that the trends are not very good there either. This is the first one. We used to adjust by moving. One of the important things we did was we moved to a new location where there were new jobs and new opportunities. We kind of stopped doing that. And again, not very long. 84, 85, a fifth of Americans moved every year. It's a lot. Now it's down to 12%. And you can say this is, right-wing critics say, well, this is because the social safety net is now so good you don't have to move. Recommend that they try living on food stamps, but I think it's something, there's some truth to it and some not such, something that's not really true. Think about yourselves. Where you live, after you've lived there for a little while, or you've grown up somewhere, you're embedded in a certain way. You know people around you who can help you, places you can get a job, places you can find cheap housing if you need to, somebody's floor to crash on, and you probably are connected, if you're low income, to sources of low income support, either charities or government services. Well, you move to New York and then what? Right? You've suddenly cut yourself off from all of those things. It used to be, I keep saying, it used to be that if you had a strong back and were willing to work hard, there were jobs, and you could do that. I think people are scared that that's not really true, and especially when you have to go to housing to find jobs in places where housing is really expensive. These circles show what's left at the end of a year if you're on a median income and you have two adults and 2 kids. In a couple of specific occupations, like being a manicurist, I think, and there are a couple of others in there. I can't read it from here. The point is to find kind of typical working class people and see how much money they have left at the end of the year after paying median rent. And you can see the big red circles show places where they absolutely cannot live. Where in New York, for example, at the end of the year, they're $90,000 behind. Well, obviously, they're not living in Manhattan, are they? I mean, but my point is, it's a real risk to go to a high rent place if you're a low income person. And on the other hand, if you're a low income person, why would you move from Pittsburgh to Cleveland? There's no more opportunity there than where you started. So we're not moving as much. Housing is a challenge. This is another reason why people don't move. So this is just my interpretation, but as the American labor market, labor movement has faded, different professions have tried to protect themselves by using the state to create credentials. So if you want to be a barber, you have to be a state-certified barber. If you want to be a manicurist, you have to get qualifications. And sometimes these qualifications take thousands of dollars and hundreds of hours of work. The chart shows that in the 1950s, about 5% of all occupations were covered by state credentials. Now, you can see it's almost 30%. This makes it really hard to move across state borders. You have to start again. It's like being a nurse from Bangladesh and coming to America. Well, actually, your nursing credential may very well require some, recertification or though the top-end professions have pretty good reciprocity. But if you're a lawyer, you have to be approved by the bar of your new state if you move. So it makes it harder to move. We have more stasis. We also have a political environment, and I didn't want to get particularly into politics, but political environment that makes it harder to do things. Look, this is a set of questions put out by Pew that tries to identify shared beliefs and beliefs that are different between conservatives and liberals and Democrats and Republicans, right? And you can see on the left, which is from 1994, that's only 15 years ago, there's a pretty substantial amount of overlap, and it was possible to get things done. 2017 doesn't look so good. Really doesn't look so good. I mean, we may be at a particular toxic point. It's possible. I wouldn't doubt it. We are. But the movement has been pretty substantial. It's very hard. If you think about all the places I've touched, trade, innovation, labor markets, education, housing, I haven't talked about healthcare, but if you talk about those things, it's kind of hard to imagine our political leaders forging a durable compromise to address these difficulties. It's just quite difficult. So I've pointed to these things. Let me run through a few indicators of what I'm seeing already, because I want to stress, in my view, we're riding the ripples of a very large wave coming behind us. We ain't seen nothing yet. So this is my analysis of the coming retail apocalypse. You've already seen the stories about the malls closing and, Toys R Us going out of business, maybe Macy's going bust. Look, this is what I think is going to happen as a result of the shift to online shopping, which I think will be dominated by Amazon, but that's another story. there are two scenarios here. One is based on basically a simple projection of where we are now and of current trends. And one is an accelerated scenario which matches how technologies, all other technologies, have been adopted. Basically, there's an S curve. At the bottom of the S, you have early adopters, people who are excited about new technologies, they try things, not a mass market phenomenon at all. Then it goes viral, and you get a really rapid uptick until you get to 70% adoption, and then it slows down again as the late adopters reluctantly decide that they're going to install a telephone. All right, and it takes time. But that rocket-fueled period is right where we're about to be in terms of retail. Right now, online retail is 11% of our retail market, only 11%. Let me ask you a question. How many of you have Amazon Prime or access to Amazon Prime? Let me see. So there are a few people who don't. There are 135 million households in America. Can you put your hand up if you think that more than half of them have Amazon Prime? Yeah. It's actually over 2/3. 96 million households have Amazon Prime now. 96 million. And that's doubled in 2 years. So what Amazon Prime does is it says when you go online and when you buy things, you're going to buy them through Amazon because it's easier, it's cheap. You don't have to pay for shipping.
But eBay is cheaper.
It may be cheaper, but then you have to deal with a seller, not with Amazon. If I have a problem with Amazon, I call them up and they say send it back, and they deal with the seller. I've had the answer, the evidence is there. Last year, Amazon had 45% of all online sales. Over Christmas, it was much higher. Anyway, that's not really my point. My point is, online is coming now. There are plenty of people. We're about to hit that rocket-fueled period. At the end of that period, in 10 years' time, it seems to be. It would be very surprising if less than half of our purchases were online. It would just be surprising, given the trends. And if that's the case, that's the high scenario. So we're going to lose, about 4 million retail jobs. The problem is that those 4 million retail jobs are not going to be replaced like for like by Amazon. Amazon's going to be a big company, but their jobs are elsewhere, and they do other things. It's not people selling on the shop floor. And Amazon is automating. That is where the robots will come. Those warehouses are going to be robotic warehouses. Amazon has bought its own robot company to do that. So what we have is, what we can see staring down at us is 4 million people looking for jobs with very poor training. These are not people who are going to be coding. Nor are they going to be people, it's telling that the Bureau of Labor Statistics projections for the single job that is most likely to grow fastest in the next 10 years is home health aides, right? Low paid, low skill. Fortunately, because we're all getting older here, we're going to need those home health aides, but that's not the knowledge economy of the future. Yeah, I'm almost done. So this is kind of banging on a bit and reiterating. This is from Bain & Company, who did a pretty careful analysis of what they see coming. And the point really here is just to say that they think that the speed of change for this coming shift in the service economy is going to be 3 times the speed that it was for manufacturing, and that during that period of when manufacturing was growing fastest, we were able to absorb about 0.7 million new workers into manufacturing every year. Well, it's going to be hard to find those 2.5 million jobs. Just going to be hard. This is another brief piece. I'm not going to spend too much time on it. You've all heard about the gig economy, I'm sure. You've heard about Uber. At best estimates I can find is that about 60 million people are connected to the contingent economy in some way. Contingent economy is not Uber. Uber is a small pimple on the backside of this. Actually, it's not even visible. It's about 120,000 people. It's not much. But part-time work, contingent work, informal work, work outside the work in the black economy, and consulting work, work where people are no longer hired but are simply used as they are needed, is growing rapidly and is a big chunk. This is another part of our economy that we kind of don't think about very much. Government has a big role here in trying to help these people to make a real living. So let me just move on to the last couple of slides. Just want to say, okay, so we should also be aware that the labor force participation rate for males has declined pretty steadily for the last 20 years, down almost 10 percentage points. These are people who just can't find work, or we can see that disability is the new social safety net that we're using. This is just a sign of stress in the labor market. This is another important trend coming out of this. The new technologies and the new economy that we're working in has allowed the owners of capital and the most skilled amongst us to essentially capture the entire benefit from productivity gains since the 1970s. So it's quite stunning. I have one more slide that is even more so. It is staggering to think that the labor share is down by about more than a tenth in only that time. And it's because of the forces we've been talking about how the balance of power has tilted inside the economy away from people in standard occupations towards management and capital. I think this is the last slide, there may be one more. So this shows what's happened since 1995 or so. And you see that tiny little black line at the bottom? Yeah, that's the bottom 50% of the population. That's how much wealth they own, collectively, together. The next, the gray slide, the gray group in the middle, is the next 40%. They've done okay, at least until the crash, they did okay. And then you can see what happened to the top 10%. This is CBO data, this is not my data, this Congressional Budget Office. It's absolutely astounding to me that the assets held by the top 10% have more than doubled in 20 years. And everyone else has gone basically nowhere. This is clearly an enormous shift in our political economy. It is, I think, rather worrying that the priorities of the owners of capital, despite this, have been to push through an enormous tax cut for themselves that will burden everyone else's grandchildren. I think it's staggering because, but historically not unprecedented. You get change after periods of conflict. And I think we're not going to change this unless we get some conflict too. This is that same slide about diverging returns to education, and I came back to it because in the end, this is everybody, right? And this is, you put this in the context of the previous slide, and you can see we have some challenges. So let me conclude. First off, yeah, speed is accelerating. Change is accelerating. Globalization train has left the station. We cannot reverse that. I don't care how many tariffs Mr. Trump puts in place. That's over because we're too embedded in the global economy now. Alan may disagree, but there we are. I don't think it's possible to hide. I think all industries are being disrupted. Look, my kids are fortunate. They're educated. They have a degree. They've grown up in a middle-class family where they've been reading books for a long time. I'm quite sure my kids are going to be doing fine. I suspect yours will too. But far too many of the rest will not. I've tried to show in a few slides just how divergent the world is now and how rapidly it continues to diverge. And I don't, you will hear people say college is the solution. We just have to get people to go to college. I just don't believe it. I don't believe we have the capacity. Colleges couldn't suddenly expand to take another 2/3 as many people. That doesn't make any sense. And the people who we are already sending to college, the marginal people we are sending to college, are failing out. 1/3 of college students drop out at the end of their first year. 1/3. So to suggest that sending more people to college is the solution seems ridiculous. What we have to do is to meet the people where they are and to provide completely different pathways. I've talked about how we're less adaptable and how our politics is more toxic. So I guess this is the final point, that in the end, the previous transformations were positive. They really were. I mean, they were painful. If you read about the Enclosure Acts and about the way that people were forced off the land in England and forced to go work in appalling factories under terrible conditions where their children were ruthlessly exploited, it's ugly. And you can understand why Engels wrote about it. But in the end, those manufacturing jobs turned out to be good jobs. And the same has been true of the service sector. By and large, people's incomes kept rising until 1970. So we were doing well. And we had a social contract that I think was broadly fulfilled. If you think today, that's one of the reasons for the pain and anger out in the world is because the social contract that we lived under in the post-war period has essentially been abandoned. This will be the first generation of Americans whose children, we are the first generation of Americans whose children will do worse than we will, economically, on average. That is a sharp departure from the American dream, that if you worked hard and you were reasonably entrepreneurial and you stuck through it, you would move up and your kids would move up. And that's what people expect. That's the mythology. That is America. And since 1970, and certainly since the mid-'80s, the evidence is pretty clear that bargain has dissolved, and people are angry because the bargain was taken away, but nobody ever explained why or how. Or maybe they were told, but they were told things that weren't actually true. So I think this is an opportunity for us. I don't want to end on a completely negative downer note. I've been quite downer enough. Look, the reality is these technologies are transformative. America as a whole is going to get much richer. That is a great opportunity for us to address the ways that we've brushed aside the previous contract. We need a new social contract. And I think we'll have to find one because the current situation, the current approach really isn't working. So,
Robin, thank you very much. I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and ask the first question, but when we go to the audience, which we will soon, if you could please remember to identify yourself, just so we know who you are, where you might be coming from, etc. The question I have is it would be very easy to take from your presentation the notion that no matter what beneficial policy measures are taken to give workers more power, to to address globalization's challenges more effectively, to educate them a lot better. At the end of the day, God, how I hate that cliche, but how about this? When all is said and done, now,
Yes.
that's not much
We have-
fun.
we have
But in the last analysis, in a relatively short amount of time, we're going to be faced with a country, at least, where there's simply not nearly enough work to go around. No matter how we deal with education, et cetera, that the numbers of jobs that, or let's say certainly gainful jobs that will be available to the working age population is going to be much smaller than that working age population. And what's that going to mean?
Yeah,
It
that's
seems
a good
like it's
question.
going to lead to profound social, cultural changes, et cetera. Nice softball question.
Yeah, nice, a simple question.
Right down the
right? I have my solution. So I would suggest that we think about this in terms of two categories. There's the material category. How are we going to make sure that in this world that is richer but much more potentially unequal, we don't end up with sort of feral packs of semi-starved people ranging between gated communities? There are plenty of dystopian TV shows out there. We can all see them. This is a problem, but in a certain sense, it's a first world problem. We'll have lots of resources. The question will be, how do we overcome our own reluctance to share them? And, there's a history here. I don't think that in the end that is the harder problem. I think it's a hard problem, but we've had social programs before, we've had redistributive policies before, we've had tax policies that made more sense. So it's not impossible, it's really difficult to do a transition. I think it seems likely that we will end up with some kind of universal basic income to deal with people's basic needs. I can't really see a way around that. The hard part about that is actually the transition. What happens when some people are working and other people are sitting on the couch taking their universal basic income? That seems like a tricky time. So on the material side, I see opportunities, and I would really say, look, most work is not that satisfying. Most people would be pretty happy if they didn't have to work so much. It's not like we all, love what we do. I've worked plenty of really crappy jobs in my time. So the thought that we could be released from this bondage is sort of the thought that Keynes had 100 years ago when he wrote his economic letter to his grandchildren about maybe working 15 hours a week or 10 hours a week. The French are working on that already. So it's not as though, but it is true that especially in America, we identify ourselves as our job. We take meaning from our job. It's how we define ourselves. You ask people, hi, what do you do? You don't ask them, what church do you belong to? Certainly not in the coasts, anyway. And there we have some models. There is retirement. Retirement's an important model. People don't just sit on the duff. They travel, they try new things, they do community service, they take care of their grandkids, they work in the community, and they sit on their duff and watch TV. So, that's one model. There are other models of more intentional communities. I'm reasonably optimistic that after a transition period, if we are released from the bondage of work, I think we will find meaning in other things. I'm sure we will. We are human, and I think we have many, many capabilities that we repress, not just in the workplace, but in the schools that prepare us for that workplace. We finally, in the last 10 years, have had, the Industrial Revolution in schools, where we bring in Taylorist strategies to measure how teachers and kids are doing. I mean, the parallels with Taylorism from the early 20th century in manufacturing are astounding. It's deeply ironic that we are creating a Taylorist education system at the precise time when the rest of the world is moving on from mass production. So, you know, so anyway, but I'm very optimistic. I think humans are remarkable, and that our ability to be remarkable may be much enhanced by the new world that we find ourselves if we don't really screw it up.
And now it's the audience's turn. So do we have a floating mic that will be, okay, so we have this gentleman on my left, okay? And again, if you could please let us know who you are, we would appreciate that.
My name is Ralph Rivera, and excuse me.
Whoops.
Hello?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just speak up.
Okay, just speak up. You look like you can
Hello,
project.
my name is Ralph Rivera. I attend here to Henry George School. So that's where I'm from. I'm also a Steve for construction work. Okay, now you talked about the jobs, right?
Yeah.
Now, those jobs that are going to be they're being created now. Those jobs are going to be taken in mostly by the younger generations because they're going to be taught in schools and things like that.
Yeah.
They have that head start. Now, the people that are getting displaced from jobs, the government should step in and inform those companies or whatever for some type of training for them to be at least compatible with the youngsters that are coming up so they could fulfill a job. Because I feel that people that are experiencing work already have an advantage because of their attitude towards work. Okay. Now, also, I feel that it's unfair how corporations and manufacturers have made their monies here. Now they have decided for the profit to go elsewhere and create jobs elsewhere and take away from us because of a few extra dollars. They break up the foundation that was created. And I explained that before. I spoke at a library one time and the corporation was speaking, and I pointed out to them, and they held its head down because it was true. They'd taken away their own foundation and weakening it and not giving us, allowing us to be surviving, and making enough money to pay the rents that are called for now. So how are we able to survive? And we should have some kind of restrictions on them, not to be so destructive.
Yeah, thank you. So two things. One, you're absolutely right. This is a special problem for older workers. Older workers are going to be displaced more because they're higher paid. So they'll tend to be displaced more, and their skill set is a poorer match for whatever's coming. You're right about training. It's absolutely there is a massive role for both for regulation and for government action, because this doesn't seem to be something that private sector is particularly interested in doing on its own. And I also appreciated your point about the role of corporations. Earlier today, Alan asked me about models elsewhere that I thought would be worth looking at, and I think we should look really closely at Germany. I see two things in Germany that are really things that we should be looking at closely. One is the notion of works councils, which give workers direct representation on governing boards of major corporations. The point here is that we have in America completely bought into the notion of shareholder returns. That the purpose, the fundamental purpose of a corporation is to maximize the returns to its shareholders. That's not the only model of capitalism. In Germany, you have workers on the board and you have the local state on the board. And they all have a stake in how that company performs and where it performs. So before Volkswagen opens a factory in the United States or in Mexico, they have to persuade the board, which includes German workers, that this is a good thing. They still open those factories, but the terms of the deal have changed, and they are very careful to protect the jobs and the livelihoods of the families in Germany. That's a good model. I like a notion. I'm not ready to abandon capitalism and competition. I don't think we need to do that. We get tremendous benefits from it. But to introduce other stakeholders into the equation in a formal way seems like a really good idea, and we should be thinking about that. The other thing about Germany that's well known and that we need to really be thinking about is the apprenticeship programs. They have very strong formal apprenticeship programs that take that stream of people that we saw who are not going to college. Well, what do we do with them? We don't prepare them in high school. We don't prepare them even really in community college because we don't resource our community colleges enough. It was one of the most disappointing things of the Obama administration to me that they didn't announce a huge expansion and increase in funding for community colleges. They are the people serving that middle group, and we need to help them. So I take your point. I do think there are other models out there. We can learn a lot from them. Yeah.
There's a fellow in the front row here. Yes. Great.
Well, thank you for your very lucid interpretation of what's going on. It's the kind of a bucket of ice water one needs.
Yeah. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Ice
I'm
water,
sure
yeah.
I'm going to be really popular.
More circulation to the brain. So anyway, I did a presentation on German Mittelstand a couple
Mm.
months ago. So yes, it's a really good model. And not only that, but they have a really responsible leadership when they put these hard reforms through.
Yes.
Because the government realized basically that 60% of the population was employed through these Mittelstand companies.
Yes.
Small to medium-sized enterprises, and that's another out as well.
Yeah.
Because there's a certain amount of capital there, but that's usually funded by public banking.
Right.
So you have to have public banking here as well.
Correct.
To do that.
Yes.
And then that's one way to do it. And then the apprenticeship program is right there. In fact, I used to work in Germany. I was a dancer there in opera. So of course, dancers have the half-life of radioactive material. So,
My wife was a dancer.
yeah, so especially for men, because
Yeah.
by 30, 35, the knees are gone. You
Yeah.
can't even lend it
Yeah.
without collapsing. And what happens, they have something called, correct me if you know, it's when you're changing profession, if you go to school and the government will pick up the tab,
Yes.
like support,
Yeah.
Berufsumgangsschule. That's it. It's a real mouthful. So I had a friend that did it, and his wife was still dancing in Frankfurt. She had moved to this old Frankfurt, but he went on to become a stockbroker in Zurich.
Mm-hmm.
And so they have the safety net there, and it works, and it really works. And the difference between stakeholder and shareholder is enormous.
Yeah.
Because the stakeholders are embedded in the community, also
Right.
in the community, and then that goes on to public banking, which is embedded within the community.
Right.
And then they didn't get hurt by 2008 banking crisis that much. It was only
Right.
one of their commerce banks.
Yes.
And then only a Landesbank, which was a sort of a processing bank for the Sparkassen, which are all the local savings banks.
Mm-hmm.
And it was specifically the Germans decided not to have a shareholder-based capital system. They specifically didn't do that.
Right.
Because they
And you see it across across their entire society. I mean, I'm a big soccer fan, and I watch what's going on in European soccer, mostly with horror, where rich people from the Emirates and from America come and China and come and buy a club and they own it. It's like just like here. It's you own your club, except in Germany.
They mismanaged it.
Right. In Germany, 51% of the shares have to be owned by the supporters. There's you can't buy a club in Germany. Not a big professional club. So it's the model goes across the society. It's not just in business.
No, so
Right.
If it's more than 5, it's not new.
Yeah. I think there was some
Were the
question.
questions, one in the back? Yeah. Just before you start, I'd like to make one point. I have about 20 years of experience working with small and medium-sized manufacturers in the United States. And they are overwhelmingly privately held companies, so the shareholder model doesn't really
Right, doesn't apply.
apply to them. But when you talk to them, and they've gone through the ringer for all sorts of reasons during that period, and when you ask them, why do you stay in business, why don't you move someplace else, why don't you offshore to Mexico, they say 9 out of 10 times, because this is where I live, this is where my family is, this is where I grew up, and I have some feeling for this particular community.
I would also add sorry, before we get to you, one thing about this. I feel it is time to revisit the notion of what is an American company. You know, in my view, you're as American as your contribution to America. And if it turns out that Siemens is building things here and employing people here and paying taxes here, then that's how American they are. And conversely, if Apple is manufacturing everything abroad and is sending its profits abroad and is employing very few people here, then they're not very important to me. I'm sorry, I don't care about them. I certainly wouldn't go to the mat defending their intellectual property against Chinese knockoffs. I don't really care. So anyway. I don't, actually. I own an Android phone. Fortunately, because I lost my phone yesterday and I would be bankrupt if I had to buy a new one.
Good afternoon, gentlemen.
Yes, sir, thanks.
I seem a little late. I got a question for you. Back in the 70s, the tuition was $3,500
Yeah.
Pennsylvania State.
Yeah.
Same Pennsylvania State now, it's about $70,000. So even you have money, they don't want you to go to the school because they got some what they call admission criteria.
Yeah.
So it's more than a monopoly.
Right.
And
Good.
we here in the school, we advocate against monopoly. So I don't see how we can balance the unemployment here in America. Because to go to school is very expensive.
Right.
So there's no way we can balance it. We have to hire only unskilled workers.
You know, you make a good point. I'm going to add that to my slide about how difficult it is to move. That now, if you move, your kids are going to face out-of-state tuition for a year, and that's not trivial. You know, I sent my kids to college recently, and I wanted them to go to a UC system school because that's where I went, and then fees were $53,000 a year. And I thought, oh, okay, I guess we're not going to do that. In fact, my son went to Canada because it was considerably cheaper. So, I totally take your point.
Do we have one further question all the way back? Yes,
and
yes,
then,
okay.
and then this lady here.
My name is Krishna Parameshwar. I'm an accountant. I'm a CPA. I have a small business. I work with small businesses. I provide them businesses like income, taxes, and so forth. So anyway, my question is, I hear the scenario that the job displacement, disruption, and all that. And on the other hand, I also hear the economy is in full employment.
Yeah.
And now some people have suggested that numbers are wrong, it's made up.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to
Sure.
what you have to say.
Well, I do think the numbers are wrong. So the numbers are wrong in a couple of places. The productivity and GNP numbers don't cover quite a lot of things. They don't cover quality changes very much in jobs. Specifically on the employment numbers, you do have to watch out for the people who are not in the labor market at all anymore, and that number has been growing. But I also think that employment and wages are some degree fungible. That is to say, if you really want to see this economy growing, you have to see growing employment and growing wages, and we have not. Wages have been flat since the early 80s. There's been 30 years of flat wages. And so there's a huge amount of sort of negative momentum in the economy that you can't really see. You don't see it in the employment numbers because people are taking those jobs. They have to take the jobs, right? But they're taking them at wages that don't show a productive, growing, high-end economy. What it's showing is lots of low-end jobs. And that's what, so the trade-off between jobs and wages has been a profoundly negative one.
I think we need the microphone up here because this woman has been very patiently waiting. We appreciate that. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Nancy Sharon, and I'm retired, so your description actually fits me pretty well. One thing you didn't mention, but I think it's another disruptive factor, is that I think a lot of people now are going to have about 4 or 5 different careers during their lifetime. I did myself, started out as a dancer.
Oh, wow.
Didn't make any money, then I went into art history, didn't make any money, and eventually got an MBA, and started to make money. I think it's kind of maybe a symptom of this disruptiveness and how fast the economy and the technology is changing, that people do have to have so many careers in their life, and it's personally disruptive as well as difficult for an economy to handle that kind of.
I would actually, you make a really good point, and I would actually say, coming from Europe, it's one of the great blessings of the American world and the American economy that America is, in Jim Fowler's words, the land of the second chance. You know, I do remember advising the Finnish government about innovation, and I was absolutely staggered by how rigid their system was. If you go bust there and your company goes bust, not only do you lose your house, which you wouldn't here, but you're a pariah. You've failed. I mean, you know, the people in Silicon Valley wouldn't even understand that. You know, their whole model is fail and move on until you find something that works. So America is in a certain sense a tremendously optimistic place. It's always been an optimistic place. It's a place where immigrants come and where people go west. And so, you know, that capacity to reinvent yourself and to have multiple careers is a huge advantage over more rigid communities. I know it's difficult. I've done it myself a few times. But I think that opportunity to find new opportunities and to have the world around you applaud you for that is a huge strength.
Further questions? Up in the front row here, so the mic can just go one row toward the front. Whoop, 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 right here, right here. Okay, thanks.
Hi, I'm Myron Pillier, I'm a psychiatrist into technologies. And I come from a completely different perspective. So the idea of economy, the science of economy, it's not really science.
No.
It's a religion.
I'm happy with that.
Doesn't make sense to me. The idea of job doesn't apply to many people in the world. There's just no such thing. There's no prospect of job. People don't think in terms of job. The idea of employment figures and all of this kind of thing is completely at odds in my way of thinking, because I've sort of simplified things down to how much can you produce and how can you distribute it. And if it's simply that, we don't really need jobs. And the Keynes idea of people working 15 hours a week makes sense. If you take a population where 50% are unemployed, and you cut down the amount of work, the amount of job needed to dip into the available wealth, then all of a sudden you employ everybody by just cutting down the work week to half. So it sounds like, if there's going to be tremendous disruption, the disruption will be a complete change in the whole idea of economics. The idea of social capital will become important, but not only in terms of being exploitable by capitalism,
Right.
but replacing capitalism to a certain extent, where people have different values and they don't identify themselves as having a certain job.
I think that will be easier when your income is not tied to your job. That's for sure. And I think there are positive models. I mean, there are lots of positive models out there of people who have found satisfaction in running their own business or in the arts or whatever. I agree with all of that. I would say there's a pretty strong literature in economics explaining why there are firms. That there are transaction costs to putting together production of something that are much higher if you don't have a hierarchy to do it. I mean, it's easier to tell somebody to do something than it is to negotiate with somebody to do something. I agree that there are inefficiencies too. I've worked in large organizations. I hated all of them. So I understand that. But firms do exist for a reason. They're just not just a historical artifacts. And I think it's going to be a while before they shrink, as you seem to suggest, right? I mean, I would love to see it, but I think we're stuck with big firms for a while. I wish we weren't.
Do we have some further questions? Okay, over here. Again? Okay.
I know another thing that's I've been thinking about recently is companies like Google and
If you could hold the mic a little closer, I think. Yeah, thanks.
companies like Google that are so global now that there's beginning to wonder, can they be regulated, should they be regulated? And they don't even, I think, see themselves as being tied to a specific country. I really think they think of themselves as being global.
I think they do. I think
entities.
they do. And your question's a good one. I think the Europeans are showing that maybe you can.
Yes.
You just have to decide what you want to do. I think the harder question is, how much do you want to regulate Google and Amazon? Facebook is a different question, I think. And I don't really want to go there because it's kind of confusing at the moment. But, the traditional antitrust model of breaking them up is not what I want. I want my Google. I want to be able to search all the knowledge in the world from one place. It's unbelievable. I don't want them to have to go to 8 different search engines to find different things. That just seems, it wouldn't be as good. I'm happy to go to Amazon and buy things and know that I got a decent price and that it's going to show up and fantastic. I don't have to think about it. So I'm not sure that the traditional breakup model really works, and I'm not sure that the alternative, which is the utility model. That's what you used to do. You just say, okay, you can only make this much money and you can only do that. Well, they're very innovative firms and we like their innovation. Utilities are notorious for never innovating about anything. So we're going to have to really work if we want. I do agree that we need to find ways. I'm worried. I mean, I showed you that slide about Amazon. If you're a small retailer and you have to sell through Amazon's platform in order to survive, well, then what? Who regulates that? What happens if Amazon says, as they have, without explanation, I'm sorry, we're not going to sell your stuff anymore? Wow, that's a lot of power. I'm concerned about that. So,
Further hands?
good question.
Okay, all the way in the back. Ibrahima.
Hello?
Oh, whoops. I think we, I think, oh, okay.
My main question is, I realize that to have access to some loans, to open a business, the first inconvenience you have is the interest rate. It's too high. So, the big banks, they borrow at a very low interest rate from the Federal Reserve, but they charge rate they receive to the local business. I mean, a lot of people try to open a business with a credit card, which offer like 22% or something like that. Now, I would say that if we lower the interest rate, there will be more people going into business.
Well, I rather than forcing the big banks, which is a hard thing to do, I think we would do better to try and compete with them through community banks, as in Germany, smaller banks, local banks, encouraging those banks and subsidizing them when necessary. I don't know. I'm an expert on a lot of things, but not banking.
Yes.
Thank you very much for this very enlightening presentation. Finland just started implementing so-called basic income as a response to the kind of problem that you just mentioned.
Yeah.
Do you see this as the way to the future? And if so, what is the best way of funding it without stifling innovation?
So I would say that there are other. Finland is interesting. There have been some other places as well. There were experiments with universal basic income in the United States under Richard Nixon, and there were other experiments in Canada, up in Manitoba, and the evidence was surprisingly strong that these experiments did not reduce the incentive to work. People tried to work just as much. The Manitoba experiments in particular were interesting because the biggest impact was that it kept kids in school because they didn't have to work. And it kept some women out of the workforce while they were pregnant. And so the biggest impacts were on healthcare, were on health outcomes rather than income outcomes. It was really an interesting experiment. So there are a number of experiments going on in UBI. It's still early days. I would love to see more at the state and local level here. I also want to understand the alternatives to UBI, including government job guarantees. And that may be an important sort of transitional thing. It's going to be hard to get to UBI, but what if, as part of the process, government was required to offer you work if you couldn't find work? This is sort of WPA from the New Deal and the Depression. So there's another model there to think about. I do think UBI has a lot, and we should be looking at it. I recommend Charles Murray's book on it. He's a right-wing economist, but he too has his reason for supporting UBI is that it can be used to replace welfare programs.
Sure.
And I think there's some, even from a left perspective, nobody thinks welfare programs are a great thing. If we could get the same result from a different process, maybe that would be a good thing.
Okay, one more. If it could be short, we are a little short on time. But bring the microphone over. Thanks.
One question would be ESOPs.
ESOPs.
Oh, yeah.
Great idea, but
sure.
Risk also, and also people forget that we are working for these internet companies. We give them our content for free.
Yeah.
We give them our tracking, our time for free.
Yeah.
So why? I think as long as consumers choose to do slave labor.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. So those are.
And also these companies, compared to the amount of their capitalization, they're not. The technology part is a very small component of that, and also the innovation which they so much tout. There's so much extra money that has been invested in them does not go to R&D or the highly skilled employees. And what do you think about users also getting a dividend back for their?
I'm a user. I'm in favor. Absolutely, but it's hard to find the leverage, isn't it? To persuade these companies that if we are the product, then perhaps we should be paid to be the product. That's the sort of a well-known Silicon Valley story that if you can't figure out what the product is, you're it. So good point about ESOPs as well.
So Google searchers of the world unite.
Yeah. ...
I'd like to thank you very much, Robin.
Yes,
These were
it was
really
a pleasure.
wonderful insights and tremendous amount of food for thought. Thank you all for coming to the Henry George School as well. We'll be staging another such event before too long, and we'll be spreading the word as soon as we can. And I'd also like to thank our online audience. We're very grateful for your interest, and again, we're hoping we can make this experience much more interactive for you in the months ahead. And again, thank you, Robin.
Well, thank you, Alan.
And,
Thanks for
what a great
inviting me.
session.
Thank you.